Welcome to Real Paranormal Activity, the network. Entertainment you'll enjoy.
You are listening to an RPA production, where people gather. LaFosse Corporation, LLC.
Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 was an international passenger flight operated by Malaysia Airlines that disappeared from radar on March 8, 2014, while flying from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia to its planned destination, Beijing Capital International Airport in China. The cause of its disappearance has not been determined. It remains the single deadliest case of aircraft disappearance in history, with all 239 of the plane's occupants presumed deceased. It was surpassed only by Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which was shot down by Russian-backed forces while flying over the Ukraine 4 months later, on July 17th of 2014. The crew of the Boeing 777-200ER, registered as 9M-MRO, last communicated with air traffic control around 38 minutes after takeoff, when the flight was over the South China Sea. The aircraft was lost from the ATC secondary surveillance radar screens minutes later, but was tracked by the Malaysian military's primary radar system for another hour, deviating westward from its planned flight path, crossing back over the Malay Peninsula and the Andaman Sea. It left radar range 200 nautical miles northwest of Penang Island in northwestern peninsular Malaysia. This path has given rise to one theory. The pilot was from Penang Island. Although no evidence exists to prove this theory, the theory remains that the pilot was going to commit suicide by crashing his plane and flew this route as a way of saying goodbye to his home. The search for the missing aircraft became the most expensive search in the history of aviation. It focused initially on the South China Sea and the Andaman Sea. Before a novel analysis of the aircraft's automated communications with an Inmarsat satellite indicated that the plane had traveled far southward over the southern Indian Ocean. The lack of official information in the days immediately after the disappearance prompted fierce criticism from the Chinese public, particularly from relatives of the passengers, as most people on the flight were of Chinese descent. Several pieces of debris washed ashore in the western Indian Ocean during 2015 and 2016. Many of these were confirmed to have originated from Flight 370. After a 3-year search across 46,000 square miles of ocean failed to locate the aircraft, the Joint Agency Coordination Center heading the operation suspended its activities in January of 2017. A second search was launched in January of 2018 by private contractor Ocean Infinity, but it also ended without success after 6 months. Relying mostly on the analysis of data from the Inmarsat satellite with which the aircraft last communicated, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau initially proposed that a hypoxia event was the most likely cause given the available evidence, although no consensus has been reached among investigators concerning this theory. At various stages of the investigation, possible hijacking scenarios were considered, including crew involvement and suspicion of the airplane's cargo manifest. Many disappearance theories regarding the flight have also been reported by the media. The Malaysian Ministry of Transport's final report from July of 2018 was inconclusive. It highlighted Malaysian ATC's fruitless attempts to communicate with the aircraft shortly after its disappearance. In the absence of a definitive cause of disappearance, air transport industry safety recommendations and regulations citing Flight 370 have been implemented to prevent a repetition of the circumstances associated with the loss. These include increased battery life on underwater locator beacons, lengthening of recording times on flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders, and new standards for aircraft positioning reporting over open ocean. Malaysia had supported 58% of the total cost, Australia 32%, and China 10%. The aircraft, previously identified as a Boeing 777-200ER and operated by Malaysia Airlines, last made voice contact with air traffic control at 1:19 MYT, which I'm assuming is the local Malayan time, on the 8th of March, when it was over the South China Sea, less than an hour after takeoff. It disappeared from ATC radar screens at 1:22 MYT, but was still tracked by military radar as it turned sharply away from its original northeastern course to head west and across the Malay Peninsula, continuing that course until leaving the range of the military radar at 2:22 while over the Andaman Sea, 200 nautical miles northwest of Penang Island in northwestern Malaysia. The plane was originally flying in a northeasterly position, and it basically did a U-turn and headed back southwest, and then turned westward to go over the Malaysian peninsula. And then after it got out over the open ocean again, it turned a little to the northwest, and then flew off a ways. The multinational search effort for the aircraft, which was to become the most expensive aviation search in history, began in the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea, where the aircraft's signal was last detected on secondary surveillance radar, and was soon extended to the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea. Analysis of satellite communications between the aircraft and Inmarsat's satellite communications network concluded that the flight continued until at least 8:19, or nearly an hour after Malaysia Airlines publicly announced the plane's loss, and it flew south into the southern Indian Ocean. So it did another turn from its original deviation and turned due south, although the precise location cannot be determined. Australia assumed charge of the search on March 17th, when the search effort began to emphasize the southern Indian Ocean. On March 24th, the Malaysian government noted that the final location determined by the satellite communication was far from any possible landing sites, and concluded, quote, Flight MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean, unquote. From October of 2016 to January of 2017, a comprehensive survey of another 46,000 square miles of ocean floor, about 970 miles southwest of Perth, Australia, yielded no evidence of the aircraft. Several pieces of marine debris found on the coast of Africa and on the Indian Ocean islands off the coast of Africa, the first of which was discovered on July 29th of 2015 on Reunion Island, have been confirmed as pieces of Flight 370. Now, these weren't very many pieces, and they weren't very big pieces apparently, but they were some pieces. The bulk of the aircraft has not been located, prompting many theories about its disappearance. One such theory, I would assume is appropriate, is that Flight 370 was taken over and landed somewhere. One thought was in the war-torn sections of Europe at that time, and that bits and pieces of the craft were removed and dropped into the Indian Ocean to give proof of an air crash. In January of 2018, a search by private U.S. marine exploration company Ocean Infinity began in the search zone that is the most likely crash site, according to the drift study published in 2017. In a previous search attempt, Malaysia had established a joint investigation team to investigate the incident, working with foreign aviation authorities and experts. Malaysia released a final report concerning Flight 370 on October 17th of 2017. Neither the crew nor the aircraft's communication systems relayed a distress signal, indications of bad weather, or technical problems before the aircraft vanished. 2 passengers traveling on stolen passports were investigated, but they were eliminated as suspects. Malaysian police identified the captain as the prime suspect if human intervention was the cause of the disappearance, after clearing all others on the flight of suspicion over possible motives. Power was lost to the aircraft's satellite data unit at some point between 1:07 and 2:03. The SDU logged on to Inmarsat's satellite communication network at 2:25, which was 3 minutes after the aircraft had left the range of radar. Based on analysis of the satellite communications, the aircraft was postulated to have turned south after passing north of Sumatra, and then to have flown for 6 hours with little deviation on its track, ending when its fuel was exhausted. The Malaysian government received significant criticism, especially from China, for failing to disclose information promptly during the early weeks of the search. Flight 370's disappearance brought to public attention the limits of aircraft tracking and flight recorders, including the limited battery life of underwater locator beacons, an issue that had been raised about 4 years earlier following the loss of Air France Flight 447, but had never been resolved. In response to Flight 370's disappearance, the International Civil Aviation Organization adopted new standards for aircraft position reporting over open ocean. It extended recording time for cockpit voice recorders, and starting from 2020, new aircraft designs have been required to have a means of recovering the flight recorders or the information they contain before they can sink into the water. The Boeing 777 was introduced in 1994 and has an excellent safety record. Well, that's according to them. When you hear it, you may not think it's excellent. Since its first commercial flight in June of '95, the type has suffered only 7 other hull losses. That kind of makes me question the safety of the whole plane. The crash of British Airways Flight 38 in 2008, a cockpit fire in a parked Egyptian Air Flight 667 at Cairo Airport in 2011, the crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 in 2013, in which 3 people died. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which was shot down over the Ukraine, killed all 298 people aboard in July of 2014. Emirates Flight 521, which crashed and burned while landing at Dubai International Airport August of 2016. And in November 2017, the 7th Boeing 77 hull loss occurred when a Singapore Airlines 777-200ER was written off after catching fire and burning out at Singapore Changi Airport. Personally, I don't fly, but if I did, and they told me I was going to be flying in a 777, I'd go hire an Uber. The aircraft was carrying 12 Malaysian crew members and 227 passengers from 14 different nations. On the day of the disappearance, Malaysia Airlines released the names and nationalities of the passenger and the crew based on the flight manifest. The passenger list was later modified to include 2 Iranian passengers traveling on stolen Austrian and Italian passports. Now, if that didn't raise a red flag, I don't know what would have, to be honest with you. The pilot in command was 52-year-old Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah from Penang Island. He joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot in 1981, and after training and receiving his commercial pilot's license, he became a second officer with the airline in 1983. He was promoted to captain of Boeing 737-400 airliners in 1991, captain of Airbus A330-300s in 1996, and captain of the Boeing 777-200 in 1998. He had been a type rating instructor and a type rating examiner since 2007. Zahari had a total of 18,365 hours of flying experience. The co-pilot was 26-year-old First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid. He joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot in 2007. After becoming a second officer of Boeing 737-400s, he was promoted to first officer of the Boeing 737-400 in 2010, and then he transitioned to the Airbus A330-300 in 2012. In November of 2013, he began training as first officer on the Boeing 777-200 aircraft. Flight 370 was his final training flight, and he was scheduled to be examined on his next flight. Fariq had accumulated 2,763 hours of flying experience. Through a 2007 agreement with Malaysia Airlines, Tzu Chi, an international Buddhist organization, immediately sent specifically trained teams to Beijing and Malaysia to give emotional assistance to passengers' families. The airline also sent its own team of caregivers and volunteers and agreed to bear the expense of bringing family members of the passengers to Kuala Lumpur and providing them with accommodation, medical care, and counseling. Altogether, 115 family members of the Chinese passengers flew to Kuala Lumpur. Some other family members chose to remain in China, fearing that they would feel too isolated in Malaysia. The planned flight duration was only 5 hours and 34 minutes, which would consume an estimated 82,000 pounds of jet fuel. The aircraft carried 49,100 kilograms or 108,200 pounds of fuel, including reserves, which would allow an endurance of 7 hours and 31 minutes in the air. The extra fuel was enough to divert to alternate airports, which would require an extra 10,600 pounds or 23,600 pounds to the different airports to be able to reach them from Beijing in case of a diversion. Some countries were reluctant to release information collected from military radar because of sensitivity about revealing their capabilities. Indonesia has an early warning radar system, but its ATC radar did not register any aircraft with the transponder code used by Flight 370, despite the aircraft possibly having flown near or over the northern tip of Sumatra. Indonesian military radar tracked Flight 370 earlier when en route to waypoint Igari before the transponder is thought to have been turned off, but did not provide information on whether it was detected afterwards. Thailand and Vietnam also detected Flight 370 on radar before the transponder stopped working. The radar position symbols for the transportation code used by Flight 370 vanished after the transponder is thought to have been turned off. Vietnam's Deputy Minister of Transport stated that Vietnam had noticed MH370 turning back toward the west and that its operators had twice informed Malaysian authorities the same day on March 8th. Thai military radar detected an aircraft that might have been Flight 370, but it is not known at what time the last radar contact was made, and the signal did not include identifying data. Also, the flight was not detected by Australia's conventional system or its long-range Jorn over-the-horizon radar system, which has an official range of 1,900 miles. The latter was not in operation on the night of the disappearance. Satellite communication resumed later on, sometime after the final ACARS transmission at 1:06. Satellite communication system aboard the aircraft went offline, possibly due to a power interruption, and then remained offline during the plane's initial deviation from its scheduled flight path. However, for an unknown reason, at 2:25, the aircraft satellite communication system booted back up and sent a log-on request message, the first message since the ACARS transmission at 1:06, and it was relayed by satellite to a ground station, both operated by satellite telecommunications company Inmarsat. After logging onto the network, the satellite data unit aboard the aircraft responded to hourly status requests from Inmarsat for the next 6 hours and 2 ground-to-aircraft telephone calls at 2:39 and 7:13, both unanswered by the cockpit. The final status request and aircraft acknowledgement occurred at 8:10, about 1 hour and 40 minutes before the flight was scheduled to arrive in Beijing. The aircraft sent a log-on request at 8:19:29, which was followed after a response from the ground station by a log-on acknowledgement message at 8:19:37. The log-on acknowledgement is the last piece of data received from Flight 370. The aircraft did not respond to a status request from Inmarsat at 9:15. The general consensus among investigators is that Flight 370 crashed somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean sometime between 8:19 and 9:15 on March 8th due to fuel exhaustion, although the exact time and location of the crash remains uncertain. Malaysia Airlines issued a media statement at 7:24 MYT on March 8th, 1 hour after the scheduled arrival time of the flight at Beijing, stating that communications with the flight had been lost by Malaysian ATC at 2:40, and the government had initiated search and rescue operations. Unbeknownst to investigators, or Malaysia Airlines at the time, Flight 370 was still airborne at the time of this initial media statement, and search and rescue operations were commenced while the plane was still in flight over the Indian Ocean. Albeit, the search and rescue operations initially focused on the South China Sea, not the Indian Ocean where Flight 370 presumably crashed. The time when contact was lost was later corrected to 1:21. Neither the crew nor the aircraft's communication systems relayed a distress signal. Nobody yelled for help. There were no indications of bad weather and no indications of technical problems before the aircraft vanished from radar screens. On March 24th, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak appeared before media at 2200 local time to give a statement regarding Flight 370, during which he announced that he had been briefed by the Air Accidents Investigation Branch that it and Inmarsat had concluded that the airliner's last position before it disappeared was in southern Indian Ocean. As no places exist where it could have landed, the aircraft must therefore have crashed into the sea just before Najib spoke at 2200. An emergency meeting was called in Beijing for relatives of Flight 370 passengers, and Malaysia Airlines announced that Flight 370 was assumed lost with no survivors. It notified most of the families in person or via telephone, and some received an SMS informing them that the aircraft likely had crashed with no survivors. On January 29th of 2015, the Director General of the Department of Civil Aviation in Malaysia announced that the status of Flight 370 would be changed to an accident in accordance with the Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation, and that all passengers and crew are presumed to have lost their lives. This being the kind of world we live in, of course, people have claimed to have seen the aircraft. According to the news media, who reported several sightings of an aircraft fitting the description of the missing Boeing. For example, on March 19th of 2014, CNN, that great trustworthy news network, reported that witnesses included fishermen, an oil rig worker, and people on the Kuta Huvadhu atoll in the Maldives saw the missing airliner. A fisherman claimed to have seen an unusually low-flying aircraft off the coast of Kota Bharu, while an oil rig worker 186 miles southeast of Vung Tau claimed he saw a burning object in the sky that morning, a claim credible enough for the Vietnamese authorities to send search and rescue mission. An Indonesian fisherman reported witnessing an aircraft crash near the Malacca Straits. 3 months later, the Phuket Gazette reported that a British woman sailing in the Indian Ocean claimed to have seen an aircraft on fire. So, had Flight 370 become a ghost ship, a la the Flying Dutchman or the Palatine Light? Interesting concept. In 2023, American comedian Jocelyn Chia was investigated by the Malaysian police for breaching Malaysian laws relating to incitement and offensive online content after making a joke about the flight at the club Comedy Cellar in New York City. The chief of the Malaysian police said an application would be filed to Interpol to find Chia's full identity and latest location. A video of her stand-up performance was removed from TikTok for violating the platform's hate speech guidelines. The Singaporean ambassador to Malaysia stated that Chia, who grew up in Singapore, did not speak for the Singaporeans. Vivian Balakrishnan, Singaporean foreign minister, called Chia's joke horrendous statements. Chia stood by the joke, stating that it was being taken out of context and had been performed over 100 times without complaints before. I could find no evidence of the joke online. This was indeed a horrible accident. Lots of people died. Lots of people lost loved ones. I don't know if there will ever be a valid explanation of this tragedy. For now, we'll just place it in the files of Terry's mysterious moments. That's all I have for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. Y'all have a good week. Be safe. Good night.